We are staring into the abyss of uncertainty right now with climate change, the climate crisis, and the American threat. So I would suggest that if we don't build that kind of infrastructure, Trump will. And there will not be any consideration for the environment or the rule of law or anything along those lines. I think that we can do better.
That's Grand Chief Stuart Phillips speaking yesterday. And now, in the last hour, he is changing his position on this or clarifying his position. In a statement, he said, "I do not support resuscitating dead projects such as the failed Northern Gateway pipeline, which would have been an absolute disaster for our land and waters. I sincerely apologize for any confusion on this point. I want to take this opportunity to commend the thousands and thousands of good people across the country, led by First Nations in BC, who opposed the project. It remains an absolute honor and privilege to have marched in the streets and stood in the courthouse in opposition." And he goes on to say, "We are very serious about the work we've done to date. We are simply not going to stand aside and let the gold rush overwhelm us. We remain acutely aware that we are in perilous times globally and need to be planning for the possibility of tariffs from President Trump." And now over in Alberta, of course, there's been this discussion as well because Premier Danielle Smith has talked about expanding oil capacity in light of the Trump presidency. And speaking to reporters yesterday, Premier Danielle Smith said that while she hopes to avoid a trade war with the United States, the threats from Trump should also be an imperative to put projects like Northern Gateway and the Energy East pipeline back on the agenda. Well, Premier David Eby was asked about this too.
Without question, diversification has to be part of our key strategy. But when you're advancing proposals, I think it's critically important that the provinces where those those projects may be located, the Indigenous people who may be affected, the national government, I think everybody needs to be a part of those conversations. From my perspective, I have some differences of opinion with Premier Smith, but where we are completely aligned is that we need to stick together as a country to defend jobs and economic activity in this province.
Now, CBC did reach out to Enbridge for comment on the Northern Gateway pipeline, and a statement says they have no plans to develop Northern Gateway. And it says our current effort is focused on leveraging our pipeline in the ground and our existing rights of way. There's lots of capacity there that is efficient and less disruptive to communities and the environment. Well, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think of this debate? And of course, we've heard now this clarification and retraction from Grand Chief Stuart Phillips saying that he continues to be opposed to the Northern Gateway pipeline. Amid all of this, what do you think of the debate around expanding Canada's oil industry and oil capacity in the face of a Trump presidency? And how does the climate crisis fit into this debate? How should it fit into this debate? Is it being left out? Our number is 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Our email is bctoday@cbc.ca. Right now, we're joined by Shelley Luce, who is the campaigns director for Sierra Club BC. Good afternoon. Thanks for being with us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Well, as I mentioned, there's been the latest comment from Grand Chief Stuart Phillips, who made news yesterday in light of the press conference, where he seemed to have softened his stance on Northern Gateway in the face of a Trump presidency. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, when it comes to the reactions to what Donald Trump's approach is, which is drill, baby, drill in the United States.
Well, I certainly agree with the Grand Chief that we are in perilous times and we're entering a very difficult political moment right now. And at the same time, the impacts of climate change are hitting us harder and faster than we ever predicted. So we do need to think about our next steps and think very carefully. I also agree that we do need more infrastructure. The infrastructure that will serve us best is renewable energy. And we have the opportunity, we have an enormous opportunity now, even with the US government, who are also pulling back on their clean energy commitments. So while they're moving forward with new drilling or whatever the new president is promising, they are also pulling back on their clean energy commitments at the very same time that the rest of the world is clamoring for more clean energy. So this is a great opportunity for us to step up and invest in renewable energy, like the 9 projects that were approved last year for BC wind projects. And most of those are 50% owned by Indigenous nations, by First Nations. So I think this is a great opportunity to move forward with new infrastructure and with moving British Columbia to the forefront of providing clean energy.
What Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre argue is that that infrastructure needs to be domestic pipelines in response to the threat from Donald Trump. What do you think of that?
I think that we've built a lot of pipelines and we've seen a lot of spills. We've seen a lot of controversy. We've seen environmental damage and human rights impacts on First Nations throughout British Columbia and elsewhere in Canada. I think we also can acknowledge that fossil fuels and fossil fuel pollution are the reason for the climate crisis we're facing, and that climate crisis is tied very directly to our cost of living. The CBC reported last week that insurance costs for homes are likely to skyrocket in 2025. And it's not a surprise given the fires and the landslides and the flooding and landslides just in October, November, a few short months ago. These disasters are hitting us more and more often, and they're hitting us in our pocketbooks as well. Food security, another area where we are going to be impacted and where prices could go up and up and up if we don't start pulling back on fossil fuel production so that we can lessen the impacts in the future of climate pollution, of fossil fuel pollution. So we have a choice. We can build more pipelines, we can build more of that kind of infrastructure, or we can build the infrastructure that's going to move us into the future and give us sustainable energy. We're going to have a lot of electricity needs here in British Columbia. Also in the US, they will want to import electricity from British Columbia as they have in the past, clean, renewable electricity. And we have such great opportunity to do that right now.
And my final question to you is: the U.S. has pulled out of, as far as an executive order from the president, pulled out of the Paris Accord again. We're not immune to what happens in the United States. So what would Trump's presidency mean for the fight against the climate crisis?
I think it's really bad news in our work to reduce climate impacts and in the fight against the climate crisis, of course. It is also a call to action to every other country in the world. And a lot of progress is being made. Overall emissions are going down in the UK, in Germany, in a lot of countries. They're going up in Canada. We can turn that around, and I think we absolutely should. The United States is a leader in many ways, but if they are not going to step up, if they are not going to continue their good work that they've been undertaking for many years to reduce climate impacts, it's just even more reason for British Columbia, Canada, and other countries to step up and do exactly that.
Shelley Luce, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That's Shelley Luce, campaigns director for Sierra Club of BC. We are asking you, what do you think of this debate around expanding Canada's oil capacity in the face of a Trump presidency? And is the climate crisis being left out of this discussion? We'll take a couple of your calls, and in a few minutes, we'll hear from Nathan Cullen, former NDP MLA and former NDP MP in the Skeena Bulkley Valley. And Chris is joining us from Victoria. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me today. How are you today?
Very well. What are your thoughts on pipelines being back in the spotlight?
Yeah, frankly, I can't even believe that we're having this discussion. I just want to know, how much longer do we need to rape and pillage our planet? How many more unprecedented natural disasters do we need to see? How bad do things need to get before we start to change our priorities as a society, and before we call on our leaders to start making meaningful policy changes? Just the fact that countries in the world, let alone major G7 countries, are planning to ramp up pipeline projects and talking about that and pull back from renewable energy solutions, and things like the Paris Agreement is completely deplorable. And it just makes me sad for future generations that are going to suffer the effects of all this. Your guest, Shelley, was bang on. I loved everything she said. And, Canada needs to be an example of the right thing to do, not follow the insane example that the U.S. is setting. The U.S., in my opinion, should be chastised and reprimanded, by the rest of the world for their policies and perspective. We shouldn't be talking about whether to align with them. So I would just love to see society take some steps in the right direction here. And unfortunately, I feel like we're going in the wrong direction.
Chris, thank you so much for the call. Troy is up next in Surrey now. And Troy, what do you think of pipelines being back in the spotlight?
I'm not very fond, actually. I do kind of agree with what Chris said. We really shouldn't be. We're in this mess right now because we have so much oil economy that makes us indebted to the United States, and now even if we try to expand in our direction, it's too late to do that. We should be investing in things we can do right now, and what we can do right now is invest in renewables, solar, wind, so on and so forth. Especially all the more so with the climate crisis. That fire in California is because of climate change. Let's be real. And if we go back to drinking more oil, it's going to make the problem even worse for us down the line. And that's about it.
Okay, Troy, good to hear from you in Surrey. Thank you. Cam at Cobble Hill, your thoughts on pipelines in the face of, in light of the Trump presidency?
Well, I think we're in bad shape. I think, number one, BC used to have 7 oil refineries. Now we have 2. We got stuff from the United States, from Washington State, and we get gouged on it. I don't think you can completely get away from oil. And I was hoping Nathan Cullen would be able to talk to him as one of your guests to talk about how things have gone as far as the UNDRIP stuff that they tried to push through the NDP with Land Act changes and placer moratoriums and everything. A person can't do any industry in BC.
Thank you so much for the call as well, Cam. That's Cam at Cobble Hill. And yes, my next guest is Nathan Cullen, former NDP MLA and was MP for Skinnamalloy Valley from 2004 to 2019. And that covered the Northwest BC from Smithers to the North Coast. Also was the MLA for the Stikine riding from 2020 to 2024. Nathan, welcome back to the program.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Well, what are your thoughts on, tell me first of all about, I guess your reaction to, invoking the names of the Northern Gateway project.
It's deja vu all over again.
Yeah.
I almost thought of it as, is this a zombie project that just keeps rearing itself? But I listened to your program earlier where you read the statement from Enbridge itself, which has no plans for this. Mm-hmm. This was always a terrible project. It put so much at risk across the north, moving diluted bitumen hundreds and hundreds of kilometers across 2 coastal ranges, 1,100 rivers, and then trying to take it down the Hecate Strait. For those that followed that proposal and all of the controversy and backlash, and made no economic sense, no environmental sense, and died on the books. The idea of raising it again seems just as dumb as it did then. I understand there's a certain worry that we all share with the Trump administration and the punishment that he's trying to bring upon Canada. But I have to agree with the vast majority of the premiers and Canadians who are saying, oh, well, we'll stand united on this. I'm not sure Mr. Trump has properly estimated the resolve and the pride of Canadians, and that we can do smart things. We don't have to reach back into the past for dumb ideas to the threats of a president who is unpredictable, and that's about as generous as I can be.
Given how long-term, some might argue that investment in renewables is still in the process, it's still in the long term, given the immediate threat to the economy here in Canada. People like Danielle Smith in Alberta concerned about that relationship, that trade relationship, and concerned about economic independence. Is this just, is expansion an easy and a reliable route to take now to be able to survive economically?
Well, understand a diluted bitumen pipeline is 10 to 20 years in the making.
Right, but in general, let's talk
idea.
Generally beyond Northern Gateway.
So look, and I would say look to the assertiveness, the sense of urgency coming from the BC government currently. Adrian Dix, Minister of Energy, is accelerating projects. BC Hydro is accelerating projects, the permitting, getting them in the ground. I'm talking to wind developers that are more excited than they've been in 25 years to work in BC because they can see a path and an opportunity. And to your last caller's point, rather than being a detriment, having the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, having partnerships with First Nations is making the business environment more positive for clean energy in BC. So put Trump aside for a moment if we can, which is difficult, I know, and look at the prospects for British Columbia in rural BC, in the Northeast, the Northwest, right across BC, Vancouver Island, for clean energy projects with a government that's willing and leaning in, as opposed to in Alberta, where Madam Smith has decided to just cross out and cancel any opportunities for alternative energy, which is just backwards to me. I don't understand it. And it feels like ideology rather than smart thinking. And I think there's just more opportunity in BC because of that, frankly, is people and companies are being pushed out, and they will bring those jobs and investment to BC if we're willing, and this government is willing to take that on. I hope the federal government leans in, and it's very important to not reach back to bad, terrible, fraud ideas somehow as a savior for us all, because they were dumb then and they're dumb now.
But how long is that transition going to take?
Oh, I think it's all hands on deck. You look at projects that have already been stood up. I'm talking to First Nations that are developing run-of-river in their communities right now, getting off diesel right now. The tankers and barges bringing diesel up the coast are fewer and fewer every year. I just think I'm more excited, and I've been watching the Energy File and the Clean Energy File for 30 years and working on it. I can see more opportunities now than I ever have before. And it's because the partnerships are there. And I think the existential threat of a Donald Trump in the White House, who's just screaming drill, baby, drill over and over again, as if that were going to be the world's solution. When we face the threats of climate change, I think there is a vast majority of people out, and maybe hopefully in the US over time, that sees that a punitive, destructive president doesn't bring them certainty, certainly is going to make cost of living higher for Americans and hurt friends, as opposed to having the opportunities that we have in BC with lots of wind, lots of rivers, lots of ability to do things smart and build that clean energy future, because we need lots of energy to come on the grid. BC Hydro is unrecognizable from where it was 5 years ago and is leaning into this project in a very, very positive way. So I think British Columbians could lead the world in what we're doing right now.
Nathan Cullen, if you don't mind holding on as we take some calls here. A lot of comments coming in. Bhupinder in Surrey is next to comment on the reemergence of pipelines as the pipeline debate and expansion in light of Trump's presidency. Hi, Bhupinder.
Yeah, thank you for taking my call, Michelle. The lady from Sierra, she was right. You know, we have to take care of our environment. This fellow south of the border, just got to ignore. He's not an intelligent person. We should focus on clean energy. Don't rush. You know, the oil in Alberta, the dirty oil, we had so many fires in California and a few years back in Fort McMurray. So we have to be on our own, and the cooler head should prevail. What Miss Danielle is saying, don't rush. You know, like, maybe she's interested in selling her oil, but we should be focusing more on clean energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bhupinder. David in Vancouver, your thoughts on revisiting pipeline expansion in light of a Trump presidency?
Hi. I agree with many of your previous callers. I just want to add the point that within the last 10, 15 years, with all the Alberta premiers that we've seen, be it Jason Kenney, Rachel Notley, or Alison Redford, we've seen them advocate tirelessly and quite vociferously for the oil industry. And it seems that the oil itself is embattled, increasingly difficult. And for a long time, Canadian oil has been advertised as a reliable and ethical source of oil. However, the fact that the premiers have to fight so hard for oil is an indication that it is subject to geopolitical turmoil. It is not reliable.
What do you say to people relying on the jobs?
I think that they are in an industry that has contributed to a lot of growth and a lot of progress in the 20th century, and now we're in a different era. We have to shift toward a different source of energy. They can still work in energy, but that energy has to come from somewhere else. And it cannot be subject to the geopolitical whims of different countries around the world.
David, thank you so much for the call from Vancouver. Good to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Bhupinder and David. Nathan Cullen, I have about a couple of minutes left here. What is it like for you to be watching this? You're out of politics now, watching the reaction, the response from that you're seeing from provincial and federal leaders.
I think it's very telling. I never thought I would see Premier Ford and Premier Wabkanu on the same stage, violently agreeing with one another, and the other premiers, Premier Eby and others, joining in chorus. I think Premier Smith being on the outside of that is a curious and I think actually unfortunate choice. I agree with Premier Ford, and again, I think many Canadians do as well, to say when you're negotiating with someone like a Donald Trump, having lots of division, caving in right away, showing your hand, whatever analogy you want to use, isn't particularly intelligent. I am curious watching, you mentioned the federal scene. Mr. Poilievre's been relatively quiet on this point. He's, of course, blaming Mr. Trudeau for everything, but Mr. Trudeau is not going to be prime minister in a few months. There'll be a new leader. There'll be an election likely at the spring or fall in Canada. It'll be interesting to see how the national leaders take on this question. Ultimately, for me, this comes to home here in the Northwest, and we're not willing to be on some sort of sacrificial chopping block for some to appease Mr. Trump in the U.S. That's not going to happen.
It will be top of mind for sure in the Liberal leadership race and in the upcoming election. Nathan Cullen, thank you for your time.
A real pleasure. Nice to be here.
Take care. Nathan Cullen, former Sakine MLA and MP.